I know it's a very, very busy day and a very busy week in Washington. So thank you all so much for being with us today. As many of you know, my name is Kristen Stevens. I'm the head of Congressional Affairs at HALO USA, and I'm joined today by Pete Smith with the HALO Trust, who I'll introduce in just a second. As we all know, a lot has changed in Afghanistan recently, and unfortunately, we're seeing an enormous humanitarian crisis unfold. And HALO, as the world's largest humanitarian demining organization, and Afghanistan was our flagship program. We've been there since 1988. You know, it's a place where we're extremely dedicated to ensuring the safety of the civilians. It's a place where we will continue to do everything we can to support the security and safety of the population. And so luckily, we are still able to work and we are still able to continue operating there. And so today we'd love to tell you more about what we're able to do, tell you a little bit about what we're seeing on the ground, and most of all, answer your questions, because I have been getting a lot of questions from congressional staffers about what we're able to do and our operations. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Pete Smith, who is the HALO Trust Deputy Head of Region for Afghanistan, the Middle East, and North Africa. Pete joined HALO in 2018, having previously served as a colonel in the British Army. In his 30-year career with the Army, he progressed from a bomb disposal officer to leading the Army's explosive ordnance disposal and IED search and disposal brigade. He served in multiple tours of Iraq and Afghanistan and was the UK Deputy Commander of Task Force Troy in 2007. The US-led counter-IED task force in Iraq, where he was awarded the Bronze Star. He was also responsible for the operational command of the UK's combined chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive security protection for the 2012 London Olympic Games. His final appointment in the British Army was as the British Liaison Officer embedded within HQ US Northcom NORAD in Colorado Springs in 2015. With HALO, he has brought technical, operational, and strategic experience to the humanitarian mine action sector, and we're very grateful to have his leadership in Afghanistan in particular. So thank you so much for joining us today, Pete. I know, for the program, it's also an extremely busy time and a time of adaptation, and we're looking forward to hearing all that you have to present today. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Pete.
Kristen, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much indeed as well for that introduction. I think that makes me feel very old, I think more than anything else, but I think it's been, from a personal perspective, great to see Afghanistan from both sides in my career. One, as a military man out here, clearing IEDs and helping others, but also at the same time, now, over the 2 or 3 years that I've spent out here with our Afghan colleagues, assisting and helping them grow in terms of the capacity to clear the explosive hazards that are there. So I hope that you have the opportunity to share our presentation, and then what I will do is take the opportunity to talk through a number of the slides that I have. It shouldn't take too long. I've got about 10 slides or so, but hopefully it'll cover most of the interests that you guys would like to listen to. But before I start, I would really like to take the opportunity to certainly thank those of you that are attending, but also more broadly to extend my sincere gratitude to Congress and indeed the United States government, because the government's had a very long history of providing support to Afghanistan, and for that, our Afghan families, their communities, and the beneficiaries that we serve, I know, will be extremely grateful. Whilst they may not see it in their day-to-day lives, I know it makes an enormous difference to their lives in a very powerful way. This slide here is one that I often reflect upon, and this is a picture of children in Jerai district in Kandahar province, which many of you may know, and is a powerful reminder to me of the very positive work and the impact of our work that we're able to deliver, and more of this hopefully through the coming sort of few minutes or so. Next slide, please, Christine. I'll probably say that a few times through this. So looking now at our footprint, I think even before the tumultuous and very rapid events that we witnessed across Afghanistan over the last month or so, the country was already one of the worst mine and explosive hazard affected countries in the world, with some 580 miles, square miles rather, of surveyed explosive contamination. I know that's a difficult amount of area to imagine, but as a mental picture, this area of land is roughly to the equivalent of about the size of London, from where I'm from, or indeed the size of Houston, Texas. But of course, it's not just about that single, simple mass of land. This contamination spans some 4,300 different sites across Afghanistan, and each of every one of those requires every square meter of land to be searched for those indiscriminately laid mines, or indeed the explosive hazards from either remnants of recent conflict or indeed past conflict across the country. I was last in Afghanistan in July this year, at a time when many of the districts across the country were falling to the Taliban, and as we saw, at a very, very quick rate. I think we saw the very, very slow isolation of a number of the provincial capitals, and what that was doing for us in Halo was reducing the operational space in which we have to conduct the life-saving clearance operations that we do. So as we were being squeezed, we were able to operate very safely up until and around about the fall of Kabul on the 15th of August. And it's here I really must pay some tremendous tribute to and leadership by Dr. Fareed, who is our country manager, and all our 2,400 Afghan staff, as they worked tirelessly through that period to safely lift themselves off the ground, and in some cases navigating themselves around the conflict that was surrounding them. But most importantly, they were all able to return safely back to their homes, and as importantly, able to recover and safely stow millions and millions of dollars of our mission critical equipment. And quite remarkably, and testament to their personal resilience and indeed their experiences over the last 30 years, we were operational again just 2 weeks later on the 1st of September. And the map you can see in front of you, it kind of highlights, I hope, in orange, the 11 provinces where from the 1st of September, our 1,800 staff were able to deploy and are operating here today. You may not be able to see the small green triangles in there, but those are the locations where they are working in teams, delivering the full range of our core life-saving activities, such as searching for and disposing of these indiscriminately laid improvised explosive devices that I mentioned earlier, mine clearance, that's traditional mine clearance, anti-personnel mines and anti-tank mines, but also explosive ordnance disposal, the clearance of munitions that have been functioned, that have either, not functioned over the last 20, 30 years, and indeed stockpiles of Soviet munitions that were buried over 30 years or so ago. And on top of that, our teams are out conducting risk education, informing the local communities of where the explosive hazards are, and trying to educate men, women, boys and girls of the dangers that they are likely to encounter, especially when they start to return back to their locations. And I'll come to this theme, as well as the theme of improvised explosive devices, a little bit later. But perhaps I'll just finish on this footprint slide by saying that in October, so the beginning of next month, when we start our next operation cycle, we expect our geographic footprint to include further provinces as well, Farah, Zabul, Baghlan, and a number of others, which will enable us to get our full complement of 2,400 staff out on the ground. Next slide, please, Kristen. It's certainly safe to say that our life-saving work that helps to keep the Afghan people and the community safe from explosive threats has never ever been more relevant or more urgent than it is now. I do apologise for the large screaming jets in the background if you can hear them. But our experience is that the most dangerous time for ordinary Afghans is right now, as conflict ends and the millions of those internally displaced people from across the country desperately return to try and return rather to their homes. You can see some numbers on the slide here that we pulled from the UNHCR, indeed, which is the UN Refugee Agency. And it has reported that some 550 Afghans have been internally displaced recently since the beginning of 2021. But actually over the last couple of months leading up to the 15th of August, that was increased again by a further 50 to 60,000. And that is in addition to the some 2.9 million Afghans who have already been internally displaced across the country. It's important here that HALO knows from our 30-year history in Afghanistan, our flagship program, and as Kristin said, the place in which that HALO was born, and certainly from our experience across a number of conflict-affected countries around the world, that we do see this as the most vulnerable time, and it's sadly a time when most civilian deaths and injuries are likely to occur. If I to try and bring that to some life for you, in the 12 months up to May this year, and immediately prior to the conflict of recent months, there were over some 1,500 recorded casualties from mines, exploded bombs, and victim-operated explosive devices. And of that total, some 694 men, women, boys, and girls were killed, with some 826 left with life-changing injuries. It's a very sad statistic, and these casualties rates are certainly amongst some of the highest in the world. But turning to the pictures that you can see, these were taken earlier this week, and they show some of our staff deploying into the field, working to clear victim-operated IEDs and searching for explosive ordnance, but also eating at the end of the day in a number of the remote camps that we have across Afghanistan. These images are important because they are very closely aligned to what we would see prior to the Taliban takeover. And my point here is that at the local level, we are very much carrying on as we were before in the places we are currently working. Although some of the dynamics have changed, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Next slide, please, Kristin. So the work that we do and the way that HALO goes about our work is very much centered around the communities and the people that we serve. It's the communities that raise their needs and their requirements, and it's the mine action sector, of which HALO is part, that responds. Afghanistan is known for over the years for having some really good coordination mechanisms in control. They have a strong National Mine Action Authority known as DMAC, but at this point it is not as fully functional as we would like it, but we are still seeing plenty of requests coming up either through the National Authority, the DMAC, as I mentioned, the Director of Mine Action Coordination, through the Taliban, or indeed even from the communities themselves. And we work to prioritize these tasks, but we're also on hand to deliver, if you like, emergency requests for assistance. But we have to be very careful and tailor those responses as we deem appropriate at the time. These two pictures show a couple of things. The first picture on the top certainly demonstrates where on the left-hand side, you'll see HALO team members, but on the right-hand side is the new Taliban Deputy Governor of Herat province. And we are finding that members of the Taliban are stepping into many of the offices that were held previously by former government representatives. And they're very keen to talk to not just HALO, but also to all of the NGOs that we are associated with and across Afghanistan. And we, HALO, are taking a proactive stance to engage with them so that we can explain to them our role and our purpose. And to a person so far, the engagements that we have had, we've found them very supportive of the activities that we do, and indeed understand the urgent need there is for us to be able to enable humanitarian aid to get through, but also to help prevent the number of casualties that are being caused currently and are likely to be caused, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, with the return, we hope, of significant numbers of internally displaced people. I have the great opportunity to talk to a number of our staff on the ground on a very frequent basis. And it's very useful for me, certainly as an individual, to get a number of insights directly from them. And I can say it differs from all across the country. It seems that many districts are not the same. And indeed, that changes to the views of some of our staff in some of the larger provincial capitals, such as Kabul, Herat, Mazar Sharif, and others. I think critical to most people at the moment is the dysfunctional banking sector. This is causing great anxiety internally. People are having to queue for days on end to receive what they're permitted to draw from banks at the moment, some $250 per week per person. And it's those elements that are affecting people most. But more widely, there is an increased sense of, with the conflict over, I should say, there's an increased sense of local security where people's lives aren't necessarily as threatened or as insecure as they once were. but of course more broadly around them as they feel that increased security and their ability to move more freely, they are often being met with these challenges of explosive devices that we talked about. But I'll certainly happily pick up on a couple of those questions later on in the themes. But before then, if we could just turn to the next slide, please, Christian, that'd be helpful. Thank you. So I mentioned we would return to the topic of improvised explosive devices, and these have long been a challenge in Afghanistan, whether they were laid by ISIS-K, the Taliban, or other insurgent groups, or indeed other criminal activists. I think the IED cat out of the bag was many years ago, and therefore this is not a surprise to us. But we are, as a humanitarian organisation, the only organisation in Afghanistan that's able to conduct the clearance of these threats. And we've developed our own capability in the country since 2018. But we've also been heavily involved in the training and developing the capacity of other national mine action organisations within Afghanistan. And we hope that in the near future, there may be many more teams joining us. But our current capacity is small, and it's only at some 24 teams. And as you would probably no doubt guess, that's certainly overmatched by the enormous and urgent humanitarian need that we have to grow that capacity right now. But we are training more of our staff, and that takes time. But we also need a much greater number of specialised detectors, those detectors that many of our militaries have grown to know and understand through their experiences in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other fields, where it is only really those detectors are the ones that are able to give us the assurance that we can safely clear the improvised explosive devices from around the country. This slide in itself shows a couple of things. The darker shading in this slide, this is really highlighting the known and recorded concentration of historical IED concentration across the country. The darker the shade, the higher the concentration. The lighter the shade, the less the concentration. But also on it, what I've tried to try and do is to put some circles of differing sizes to try and represent where we also understand where the new contamination has occurred over the last several months. There's no great accuracy in that at the moment in terms of we've not measured it, but what we have done is pick that up through anecdotal reports from our footprint across the country, but also through many of the reports that we are receiving and hearing from local communities and from the Taliban to say that there are threats in these locations that are affecting the normal return of people and the normal pattern of life in many of these areas. And also we draw on some of the anecdotal evidence that we're able to, sorry, excuse me, some of the anecdotal evidence that we're able to draw upon, given our 30 years of experience in the country. We've heard stories of truckloads of improvised explosive devices being driven up to the Panjshir Valley. And many of you will have heard about the last sort of hold of that particular area within Afghanistan. We've heard tales of civilians, unfortunately, bypassing normal routes and then unfortunately being blown up by roadside IEDs that were recently in place to try and deny the Afghan National Security Forces from moving one location to another. And we've also heard tales of Taliban blowing themselves up in their attempts to try and recover the IEDs that they had laid previously. But I'm going to look a little bit now from a technical perspective, and forgive me this moment of indulgence. And if I could ask you, Christian, please to move to the next slide, that would help me explain some of this. Now, I don't want to go into too much technical detail. Many of you may already have some knowledge and experience of improvised explosive devices, but I just wanted to highlight some of the complexities that our trained deminers face now on a near daily basis. This image is of an alleyway in District 15 of Kandahar City, and you can see on here a green gate that is common to most of those pictures. This is actually an alleyway that runs down the center of a residential area, and if you can imagine, before you approach this particular gate, to your left and to your right, there are a number of these gateways entering into other residential premises. But in front of you, you can see the location of two improvised explosive devices, one off to the left and one off to the right. And of course, in normal eyes, you would think, well, that's not necessarily a very clever thing to do. Why wouldn't you put it directly in front of the gate? But certainly through the military experience that both the US, the Brits, and our other allies have had in terms of understanding how these IEDs are laid. This is of no surprise to us, but we don't make those guesses, we don't make those assessments. We deliberately clear each and every square meter of land moving up to those areas where we know and understand there to be an IED threat. And these two IEDs, as you can see to the left and to the right of this particular gate, are not in the most obvious of locations, but that is certainly something that we train into the teams that we have across Afghanistan, and take quite considerable time in them understanding the threat that they're facing, but also the skills that they need, the concentration that they need to be able to detect, locate, and then destroy these explosive devices. So thank you for allowing me the indulgence just to share a couple of those pictures with you. And Kristin, if we could just move to the next slide, please, as well. Thank you. Here I'm going to just turn to the topic of firing ranges. And a major legacy of the 2001 intervention in Afghanistan is the number of remaining US and NATO military firing ranges. And these firing ranges cover a staggering combined area of some 243 square miles, which is the equivalent, I understand, to at least half the size of Phoenix, Arizona, or Los Angeles. But they were used by our militaries to fire live ammunition for mission rehearsals and to practice with their land and air weapon systems. And this land is now no longer safe until it has been cleared. But it's great swathes of agricultural land that can be turned into immediate use. And to make this point, tragically, since 2014, there have been some 184 recorded victims of accidents on these ranges, including 63 of them being killed and 121 being injured. And of these, some 129 were children. Additionally, nearly 750,000 people live or work close to these ranges, putting their lives at risk too. And clearing the firing ranges of explosive hazards would not only remove the risk of accidents, but as I mentioned earlier, put that land quite quickly back into immediate use for agriculture, livestock, and people would have much, much safer access to important services such as schools and clinics. All of these firing ranges in Afghanistan can be cleared relatively simple. They're not as complex to clear as the improvised explosive device problem are, or indeed some of the historical clearance of mine action areas, and really just require the combination of people, manual and mechanical clearance techniques to safely be able to locate, remove, and destroy these items. So that's firing ranges. And if I could just ask you to move to the next slide, please, Kristin. So I hope what you've been able to gather so far from the slides that I've been able to show you is that I hope you can see the human importance for the work and why we do it in Afghanistan. Over the last 30 years or so, we've cleared over, I think it's over 820,000 mines and destroyed nearly 13 million items of unexploded ordnance of all types of calibers. And by calibers, I mean mortar bombs right the way up to large aircraft bombs. And we've also cleared a staggering 1,223,880,774 square meters of land. I tried to get meters in rather than miles because I'm more familiar with it. But either way, it's a staggering amount of land, as you can imagine, that we've been able over that time to return safely back to the communities across all countries across all corners of the country. And then just on the right-hand side of that slide, you can see there are a number of comments. We often conduct a number of surveys just to make sure that we genuinely understand the value of our work. We're not just about lifting the explosive items out of the ground, although clearly that's a very important part of what we do. We ensure that wherever we work, it's done in a prioritized way, that we're able to hit those communities that are affected the most. And I think some of those tributes on the side and some of the percentages that we put out there come from a recent survey conducted by Samuel Hall, which we gladly share with a number of you, which demonstrate really the impact of our work and certainly some of the importance of our work going forward. And I think my final slide, please, Kristin. Here, I'm just going to spend a couple of moments just covering some of the challenges and hopes that we have for Afghanistan going forward. Of course, we are in new times and there are a number of challenges ahead. that we internally within Halo, but also more widely across the community and with our international donors, are spending a lot of time carefully and very, very carefully discussing and deliberating upon. And some of those are and will be immediately identifiable to you. Clearly, high amongst them are the rights of women and minorities going forward. For us, it's also about the availability of cash in the country so that we're able to continue our work. Also, there's the absence and adherence really to some of those norms such as international law and how that may or may not change over time. We're also looking very closely at the potential fragmentation of the Taliban movement and what that may do internally for the security. But we're also looking very closely at the access opportunities for our international staff to be able to return fully back to Kabul and travel more widely across Afghanistan. We have a balance of men and women within the Halo Afghanistan program, and we want to be able to make sure that we're all able to return safely back to work and work alongside our Afghan colleagues. So we're going to continue very carefully to consider all of these challenges, but what is clear is that we and the wider mine clearance sector across Afghanistan has a great opportunity to continue to positively assist all of the ordinary Afghans that are affected by these explosive hazards that I've described. What we do in the mine action sector is uncontroversial. It saves lives and it frees land for agricultural and other development opportunities, enhancing the lives of a deeply impoverished country. It's also an incredibly dignified and honourable employment, and one that is both recognised not just by our Afghans, but as one that's been recognised equally by the Taliban, who some 20 years or so ago, when they were in charge of Afghanistan last, or certainly had governance, they issued a fatwa at that time to make sure that everybody involved in the removal of explosive devices across the country would be permitted to get on and do that, recognising the humanitarian need of it for all Afghans. But importantly, with the conflict now over and with a much, much improved security situation across the country, we are expanding and anticipate to be able to expand into many, many more areas across Afghanistan. That's not just into areas within Kandahar city that I spoke about most recently, but it's also into those mine-affected provinces around the country that were previously inaccessible to us and the wider mine action sector. So there will be a heavy emphasis on us supporting those displaced by the conflict so that they can safely return home, but also to clearing explosive items that allows other humanitarian agencies to safely go about their business and safely access the communities that they need to serve as well. But lastly, and importantly too, we also have a very significant moment where we have an ability to provide mass employment across the country. And we certainly believe that this would be a really strong contributing factor to helping to further stabilise the local communities that we've been able to support up until this date. So I think that's me. I know I've covered a lot in that time. I apologise to Kristen if I've gone on longer than I should have done, but certainly I'll hand over to you now to complete.
Thank you so much, Pete. That was really helpful information, and hopefully everyone attending found it useful as well. So I'd like to pick up to talk a little bit more about how you as congressional staffers can help the people of Afghanistan and how you can support the great work that organizations like Halo are doing to promote safety and security in Afghanistan during this very troubling time. But before I kind of discuss a few of these bullet points along the side here, I just want to remind everyone and in fact introduce everyone that I see a couple of folks have populated questions in the Q&A box. Please feel free to put any questions that you have in that box, and after I'm done speaking, we'll turn it back over for Pete to answer some of the questions that you all have. So please don't be shy about inputting your questions into the Q&A box. So back on the point of how you can help. So there's a few things that would be very helpful. So first and foremost, resources for demining programs. There's been, a lot of new funding made available to provide assistance in Afghanistan. And so as you are talking to your bosses and as conversations with the administration come up, any immediate resources that can be made available for conventional weapons destruction activities in Afghanistan would be very well programmed and make an incredible impact, because we are one of the few organizations that is able to operate. And like Pete said, hopefully we'll be able to continue to expand our work to help improve safety during this time where, again, as Pete said, it is the most dangerous for civilians as there is greater movement around Afghanistan, but also a much higher number of explosive devices. As many of you know, humanitarian demining falls under the conventional weapons destruction account of the State Department budget. And that's what we refer to as in terms of conventional weapons destruction programs. So any immediate resources that can be made available for these programs, like I said, can be immediately put to use and make an immediate impact to free up land, be it on the firing ranges or be it in the heart of communities that are already developed. Beyond sort of the immediate resources, we would also greatly appreciate 30 million in the fiscal year 2022 conventional weapons destruction section of the appropriations budget. And again, this comes out of the SFOPS budget within the State Department section. The CWD component of the budget falls under the NATOR line, the Non-Proliferation, Anti-Terrorism, Demining, and Related Program section of the budget. And, we have been so incredibly grateful, and thank you so much to all of you on this call that have been so incredibly supportive of these programs and ensuring resources have been made available. And in the House draft, we are so pleased to see increased funding for the CWD account, as well as some general language supporting demining programs in Afghanistan. But without a specific figure of 30 million, which would represent about a $10 million increase from past years, we can't access some of these benefits that Pete is talking about, that ability to scale up, to provide that mass employment, and frankly, be able to hire on maybe some of the actors who could otherwise be further destabilizing to Afghanistan. We are currently working with the State Department to try to employ former Afghan local police, for example. And there's a lot more of those types of programs that we can be able to implement to keep civilians safe, but also at a time where poverty and economic crisis is a major problem, be able to provide steady employment to families as well. Furthermore, really appreciate the help from many of the folks on this call on supporting appropriations language, supporting IED clearance in particular. We are incredibly grateful for all of the support we get from the State Department and from the US government in general for these programs. But I think an area where there's greater potential to make an impact, and like Pete said, there is just a greater number of IEDs throughout the country that will continue to see casualties on, unfortunately. An area of great potential is for resources to be specifically directed towards the clearance of IEDs in a way that's not necessarily as prioritized right now. And so that's something that really the past few months have increased as a challenge in Afghanistan. And so that's something we'd greatly appreciate the Senate mirroring the language that's already in the House budget draft, supporting resources for IED clearance and ensuring that makes it into the final appropriations bill. And of course, any immediate resources that can be made available, again, can be programmed right away. And lastly, supporting the clearance of those firing ranges that Pete indicated. This is something where I think there's a lot of questions as the US has withdrawn. What happens to that legacy contamination from the US, from NATO, that's now been left behind, that now unfortunately will likely continue to cause casualties. And so it's an area where, the same way that the US is emphasizing clearing its legacy contamination in places like Southeast Asia, we hope to see the US do more to empower organizations like the Halo Trust and other implementing partners and partners of the US government in country to be able to clear these firing ranges to ensure they can be put to productive use. So if you'd like to be more involved in this, if you'd like an individual briefing, I'm more than happy to come chat with any of you. I think all of you have my contact information, but I'll be sending out a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar, just in case not. And I'm more than happy to discuss with you any of these points in greater detail or provide additional information. But with that, thank you again so much for tuning in. We're going to turn to the Q&A portion. So I am going to stop sharing my screen as I multitask here. And let's dive into some of these questions, and please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box as we move forward. So the first question is the US funding IED clearance? And if not, who is funding this clearance? Pete?
Thank you, Kristen. Yeah, I can take that one. The answer is no, the US isn't funding it at this moment in time. We've developed this capacity over the last 2.5, 3 years, and we were very able, because of a number of bilateral donors that we had, the Germans and the Dutch, who I know won't mind being named, we were able to develop this capability together. And they had great confidence in Halo because we've had strong bilateral relationships over a number of years to actually understand the threat and the import of the threat, but also at a time when it was focused on ISIS-K. So we developed the capacity so that we could remove the mines that were laid by ISIS-K, because we called them at that stage abandoned improvised mines, for 2 points. One, because the fact that they were abandoned demonstrate that they had no political allegiance to one side or the other. And that was significant to us, but also it was also a way of ensuring that the communities and the communities they lived in were able by the Taliban equally to see that these needed to be removed, because as many may or may not know that ISIS-K are sworn enemies of the Taliban, and it made sense for those communities around there for us to be able to invest our capacity into clearing those mines. And it's been over the last 1.5 years or so over time where we've been able to grow that capacity to the 24 teams or so that I mentioned earlier. And since that time, we've broadened the donor pool a little further. A number of UN-backed donors, UN OCHA, for example, are leading some support for a couple of teams that we have in another location in Nangarhar. But more broadly, this is the area where we really do need to expand more quickly. And certainly, I would be reaching out to all countries, and that's not just the United States, but the United Kingdom and a number of others, to be able to really to be able to lean in where we can on defeating the improvised explosive device. It is the highest casualty causing weapon out there at the moment across Afghanistan. Of those numbers that I spoke about earlier, in terms of the casualties, 60% of those casualties are caused by improvised explosive devices, and less so by mines and explosive remnants of war. I hope that answers the question, Kristen.
Thanks, Pete. The next question here is, if the US were to support clearing these firing ranges, how many vulnerable Afghans could be employed quickly, potentially, youth who might be tempted to join ISIS? About how many do we think we could potentially employ?
I mean, that's a great question. Depending on the number of people that we are able to recruit and put into the field, we could very quickly put 1,000 deminers and train them within a month and have them making a difference to all of those great swathes of land. The activities that they will be conducting, as I mentioned earlier, are not particularly technical. We need small numbers of technically trained people to blow the things up, but actually, and dispose of them. But we need great swathes of people to be able to do the clearance and the use of detectors to be able to find them. We can train thousands within a month, and we can have them deployed the month afterwards. And because of the scope and size of the areas that I said to you, if we build up in factors of 1,000, that's how quickly we can deploy numbers onto across the firing ranges. So it's really, there's no lack of ambition, let's put it that way. We have the capacity to train, but significantly we have the capacity to be able to go to those communities and to train. Largely it is, I will say, a male sport, and I don't mean that in a provocative sense, but largely because of the communities and the natures of where these minefields are, etc. It will largely be an activity that will hopefully equally contribute to the stabilization of a number of those communities, because it will be giving high percentages of unemployed people other opportunities, other decisions to make with their lives as well. So very quickly, and large amounts of Afghans can be employed for the clearance of these firing ranges.
Thanks for that. The last question that I have listed here is about the role of women and girls within HALO. You know, you mentioned that HALO is able to employ women on the HALO Afghanistan program despite the cultural sensitivities. There's a question about whether HALO's female staff have been able to return to work. Maybe you can speak to that.
Thank you, Kristen. Yeah, I will. I think first and foremost, it's important to say that from HALO's perspective, and indeed many of the other NGOs out there at the moment, our highest priority is to make sure that our female staff are safe, and we will do nothing to compromise their own personal safety and security at this point. And it's quite interesting that across Afghanistan there is still a fairly mixed picture in terms of how down at the district level, indeed always up to, even up to provincial level, where there are different announcements or different permissions that are being permitted to enable our women to go back to work. We are able in Kandahar, for example, to employ our women in a Maharam structure. And for those that aren't aware, that is where, and it's traditional across Afghanistan, where a female member of staff is accompanied by a relative, whether that's a father, a brother, or other significant male in their lives, and they're able to conduct and continue with a number of the survey activities that we do, being able to interview, importantly, women's groups within the communities that we serve. So that is the picture that is developing in Kandahar at the moment, but it's certainly different to other areas, and we're not seeing a consistent view. So we are watching it very, very closely. We're very, very keen to have our women back to work. So long as we can provide for their safety, and of course at the same time make sure that wherever possible we're able to keep them safe in the roles that they do, but also within our Kabul office too. We have not just women that go out and do explosive risk education, but we also have technical GIS experts, or those very, very clever people that can sit on computer screens, which I can't, and manipulate data and produce some of the most eye-watering facts and analysis that we do. And we have a number of them that are able to work from home. We've all experienced the COVID crisis recently. We're all fairly familiar with remote working. So a number of our women are also able to safely work remotely from home at the moment. I hope that, again, answers that question.
Yeah, and another question just came in. Do you think the Taliban would allow HALO and other demining groups to hire former members of the Afghan army and others who used to work with the US military?
That's a really good question. And what I would say is that wherever we have worked and for however long we have worked, you know, we do community-based demining. The heart of where we go is those communities that are most affected, those people that are living there, working there, and it's part of their daily life. So wherever we go, we can only really, and have up until now, only been able to do that with the consent and the permissions and indeed the willingness and acceptance of us being in that area. And because we are such a large organization and we are a mass employer, we do and are able to come in with some significant leverage, as you can probably imagine, coming into these areas that can present some livelihoods for a number, in most areas that we go to, you know, several thousand families and extended members. So we take a very pragmatic view here in that it's the communities that we are there to serve. So we will look very broadly across the community set, and therefore it's very difficult to say that we would certainly not expect or not anticipate the Taliban to say whether they choose who is going to be employed or not. That's never been our stance, and it never will be our stance going forward. We as Halo will make sure that we employ who we believe are the right people to employ.
Thank you so much, Pete. If Congress could increase support for just one aspect of your work, what should it be? I'm happy to answer that kind of broadly from my perspective. And then Pete, maybe if you want to emphasize from the Afghanistan perspective, what would be most useful, that would be helpful. So I would say, for those seeking to support demining programs broadly, the best way to have an impact is to support an increase for the conventional weapons destruction account. Again, the State Department section of the SFOP's budget, the NATOR CWD line. And it's one that, we're quite fortunate to be able to have seen an increase in support in the House budget this year. And we certainly hope to see the same in the Senate draft, which obviously we haven't been able to see yet. That is going to have the greatest impact for demining, not only in Afghanistan, but worldwide across 40 plus countries, is supporting an increase to the conventional weapon destruction account to a tune of $262 million. And, that's something that many members of Congress have supported. And so we certainly hope to see that in the budget, but there are so many priorities. But I would say, from a broad perspective, that's something that will make the greatest impact, and certainly ensuring as great of a carving as possible. 30 million for demining in Afghanistan specifically would be helpful. Diving into maybe a few more of the specifics, Pete, what would you prioritize?
That's a great question. It's always a privilege to be able to try and direct funding and work out how the priorities would play. I think, in my mind, I hope that I've been able to share the challenge that the improvised explosive device and the victim operated ones, the indiscriminate way in which they're being laid, is presenting perhaps the closest humanitarian crisis at this moment. This is where most of the casualties are going to be happening, certainly in the near term. But by near term, I mean months, 6 months to a year, and that's largely dependent upon us being able to get our capacity trained, etc. And there is only really one major hurdle to that at the moment, and that is the demand we have for
I think we may have lost Pete. Oh, Pete, your connection went, but now you're back. If you could maybe pick it up, that would be great.
Sorry, yeah, I don't know where I fell off there. That's my difficulty in Yerevan. So the challenge that I hope I managed to get across was the improvised explosive device. That is the one that's causing the most humanitarian crisis at the moment. And actually, the long pole in the tent, if you excuse the analogy for us, is about the availability of these specialized detectors and being able to get those into country. We can train people very quickly, but it's about detectors. So that's the near-term emergency, and that will stop people that are tragically going to be dying in the months and years to come because of the IED. But also, if you want to be able to return great swathes of productive land back to the communities across Afghanistan to enable them to be able to grow a degree of self-sufficiency and increase their livelihoods, the next focus would be on the clearance of those large swathes of land from firing ranges. So it's a difficult place for me to balance both, but I would probably go towards the improvised explosive device right now because of the humanitarian crisis unfolding.
Yeah, and one thing that I forgot to mention before that would be useful for the attendees to know is regarding the firing ranges. I failed to mention that the Senate report for the NDAA, the SASC report, does include some specific language acknowledging the challenge of the unexploded ordnance on these firing ranges and encouraging the Army Corps of Engineers, which manages or has previously managed, I think there's some questions about moving forward what this will look like, encouraging an assessment of working with local partners such as Halo and others to ensure this job gets finished. So that's something I want to flag for you all. Again, it's in the SASC committee report in the NDAA. And so hopefully that's something that it's not in the House version, but perhaps could be something that makes it into the explanatory statement as the chambers come together. So we're about at time, so I think we should call it there, but I just want to thank everyone who took the time to be with us today. I look forward to hopefully having some follow-up conversations with all of you to discuss these matters, and thank you so much again. Thank you to Pete for taking the time during a very busy time for the program as well, for being here. So thank you, Pete.
No, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you all. And again, once again, just to reiterate my thanks at the beginning for the tremendous support that the programme has had over 30 years or so from the US government, and indeed the wider engagement, Christine, that you do on behalf of Halo and the wider advocacy. So thank you to everyone. It is greatly appreciated.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll keep you updated on our operations as they move forward. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.